There's this hidden, almost shadow part of our economy that's been, well, just running on fumes for years. It's been propped up by forces we're really only now starting to fully grasp. So today, we're going to dig in. We're going to investigate how these companies, these economic zombies, have managed to stay in business and what happens now that their life support is finally being switched off. All right, let's get into it.
I want to start with a question that honestly gets right to the heart of this whole thing. What if a huge chunk of the companies you see every day, companies listed right there on the stock market, are already, for all intents and purposes, dead? They just don't know it yet. It sounds like the plot of a movie, right? But the data? Well, the data suggests it's very, very real. So according to the Federal Reserve's latest estimate, before the pandemic, that number is at least 10%. That's 1 out of every 10 publicly listed companies. And what's really wild is that this share is nearly double what it was just 20 years ago. Now, some other, more aggressive counts, they put the number of these unviable firms as high as 40%. This is a massive, growing problem that's been hiding in plain sight. Okay, so to really understand what's going on, we need to do a little investigating. And first things first, we have to define what exactly we're looking for. What in the world makes a company a zombie? Let's put a pin in exactly what we're talking about here. Economists have a pretty specific definition for these zombies. It's a company that, by all normal business measures, should have failed already. But it manages to keep shuffling along, sometimes for years, by feeding on just one thing: incredibly cheap credit. See, it's not actually earning its survival, it's borrowing it. So how do you spot one in the wild? Well, they have a pretty clear profile. They're usually older, established companies, not brand new startups. They are just drowning in debt. Their sales are consistently shrinking year after year. And they generally have terrible returns, very little cash on hand, and almost no real opportunities for new investment. They are, in a word, stuck. Now, this is an absolutely crucial point. We have to be really careful to separate these zombies from promising growth companies. Think about it. A new tech company might be unprofitable for years, but that's because it's pouring every dollar into research and development, building a product, capturing a market. It's investing for the future and often has very little debt. A zombie firm is the total opposite. It's an older company with a failing business model and just a mountain of debt. Which brings us to the next huge question in our investigation. If these companies are failing, how on earth have they stayed afloat for so long? What, or who, has been keeping them alive? The main culprit was the long era of cheap money that we all just lived through. For more than a decade, we had historically low, near-zero interest rates. That made borrowing incredibly easy. And for a struggling company, this was a lifeline. They could just keep taking on new loans to pay off their old loans, never actually having to fix the real problems under the hood. Let's make this tangible. I want to look at a powerful real-world example to see just how this played out. I want you to meet Yellow, a massive trucking company that had been in serious trouble for over a decade, long before the pandemic even hit. To stay afloat in its final years, Yellow got a bailout loan from the government for $700 million. This wasn't just a little helping hand. This was a massive infusion of cash designed to keep the company on the road. And this is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. So the company paid back nearly $55 million in interest on that massive loan. But when we look at the principal, the actual loan amount they were supposed to pay back, the number is, well, it's shocking. Before the business finally went under, it had repaid just $230. Not $230,000, $230. And here is the inevitable, tragic human cost. When the company finally filed for bankruptcy, 30,000 people were laid off. The can was kicked down the road for years and years, but eventually, you're going to run out of road. It hit a wall. Well, that wall is here. The era of cheap money is definitively over. The Federal Reserve's fast and aggressive interest rate hikes have completely changed the game, and that's triggering a massive reckoning for these zombie firms. And you can see the direct result right here. Through just September of 2023, 516 corporations had already filed for bankruptcy. That is a huge surge from what we've seen in recent years. The cost of borrowing has just skyrocketed, and for companies that were only surviving because of cheap debt, their business model is now simply broken. So, while all of this sounds painful, and it is, many economists, like the former head of the FDIC, Sheila Bair, argue this is actually a necessary evil.
It's a purge. You see, propping up failing companies crowds out the money and resources that could be going to healthy, innovative businesses. So letting them fail, they argue, is actually better for the economy in the long run. But what are the long-term risks if we don't get this right? To understand that, we need to look at a historical precedent that really serves as a chilling warning. Let's talk about Japan in the 1990s.
What happened in Japan is the classic case study. Their share of zombie firms just exploded after 1994. And why? Because their banks were weak and undercapitalized, so they had this perverse incentive to keep lending to failing companies. Why would they do that? Well, it allowed the banks to avoid admitting they had massive losses on their own books. And the result of all this? A decade of economic stagnation that we now call the lost decade. And this is where the story gets a little uncomfortable because you start to see some parallels to today. Some U.S. banks are also facing pretty big losses on their portfolios. The fear is that if they get constrained, they might not have the capital to lend to the healthy parts of the economy, and that could risk a period of much slower growth for everybody.
All of this brings our investigation right up to the present, very uncertain moment. The zombies are finally being exposed, the financial world is shifting under our feet, so what happens next?
This quote really sums up the consensus perfectly. Economists and policymakers, they all know that the path of propping up the economy with endless, cheap debt just isn't sustainable. The change has to happen. The only real question is how painful that transition is going to be. And so we're left with this final really provocative question. As these companies finally face the music in a changing economy, are we watching a painful but necessary purge that's going to lead to a healthier system? Or are we seeing the first tremors of a much larger problem, one that could lead to our own version of a lost decade? The truth is, we're all finding out together, in real time.